All right. So welcome everyone. This is our free prep hour for January 19th, 2020. My name is Scott Miller. I'm going to be your instructor tonight. And welcome to everybody who is joining us here live tonight on January 19th for this free prep hour. And welcome to anyone who is watching the video at a later date. Just to let you know a little bit about so we do these free prep hours twice a month usually. And anybody who wants to can sign up for one of these and join us live. There are a lot of other really good free resources on our website. So if you go to our website, and you don't need to worry about copying down the link right now, I am going to put some links for those of you who are here live tonight with us. I'm going to put some links in the chat window to some of our free resources. I'll do that at the end of class. If you're watching the recording, you can scroll down and look at the information for this recording in YouTube, and you'll see links to these free resources there. All right, here's what we're going to talk about tonight: reading comprehension. And what we're going to do is look at a couple of reading comprehension passages tonight and some questions accompanying those passages. And what I'd like to focus on tonight is, we'll talk about some of the basic stuff, like why the right answers are right and why the wrong answers are wrong. But what I'm going to focus on is showing some suggestions, some tips for how to review effectively when you are, anytime you do timed work, anytime you do any kind of timed work on the LSAT, it's always really important to go back and review it thoroughly. And this is a step that really a lot of people neglect. A lot of people, you answer some questions and you go and look up what the right answer is and see if you got the question right. And if you got it right, you kind of ignore it. And if you got it wrong, you go and try to figure out why the right answer is right. I mean, people do some review, but it's often kind of superficial. And really, if you want to push your score up, if you really want to improve your score, doing a thorough review is a really crucial step. A lot of the things that you practice when you're reviewing a question are going to help you work more effectively and more efficiently when you're actually working under live timed conditions. So review isn't kind of, I think a lot of people think of something as review, or a lot of people think of review as like an optional step or something that's not really directly connected to your performance under time conditions, but really it is. It's very, very directly connected. You're practicing things when you're reviewing. They're going to help you a lot under time conditions. And I'm just curious, for those who are here with us live tonight, in the chat window, if you wouldn't mind, what are, maybe in a few words, describe what some of your biggest challenges are with reading comprehension. If you had to describe just in a few words, what is the main thing you're working on, the main thing you're trying to improve in reading comprehension right now, what would that be? Can you put that in the chat window? Time. Hung up on the details. Okay. Yeah, these answers coming through are common issues that people have, common things that people are trying to work on or improve. IDing keywords, time. All right. So let's see if we can, as we're going through this tonight, let's see if we can help with some of those specific issues or talk about how some of what we're talking about tonight, we'll see if we can discuss how it relates to some of those specific issues. Again, we're going to use questions from the June 2000 LSAT. The reason we do that is because with these free prep hours, since they're free, we like to rely on resources that are available for free, that you can have access to for free. And so that June 2000 LSAT is one that LSAC has traditionally made available for free through their website. You can download it and print it out if you want, or just work off the PDF. And so what you'll be able to do if you want is go back and review some of these, some of these passages and questions that we talk about tonight. If you want to go back and review on your own after this. All right, so what I'm going to do is put a passage up on the screen. And if you've already read this passage, if you've already worked on the June 2000 test, that's fine. It's actually totally fine, because a really useful thing that people often underestimate is just rereading passages that you've already read before and reviewing questions that you've already worked on. And a lot of people, I wouldn't say a lot of people, what some people say is, yeah, I kind of already remember the passage. I kind of, remember the passage because I've read it before. That's great, because as you read a passage, I mean, I recommend to my students, when students come to my courses or when I'm tutoring someone, I'll recommend that they reread passages like 4, 5, 6 times. Like, you work on a passage this week or tonight, wait a couple days, read it again. Wait a couple more days, read the passage again. Wait a couple more days, read the passage again. So take a little bit of time in between each read, but reread passages. What that does for you is like some details will start to become familiar. Some parts of the passage will become familiar, but you'll start to notice things that you didn't notice the first time you read the passage or the first couple of times that you read the passage. And these can be some of the, important details that can help you when you go to answer the questions. Some of the things we're going to talk about tonight. So, Lisa, you put in the chat window, you said getting hung up on details is, an issue for you. And so one of the things that will help you in reading comprehension on the LSAT is to realize that not all details are equally important. So some details you do want to pay a lot of attention to when you're reading and really try to remember. Other details you don't have to remember. And learning which is a big part of your success of reading comprehension. And just rereading passages is a really good way to learn how to. You'll start to because especially if you've already worked on the questions, as you're reading the passage again, you'll get a better sense for which details are important and which ones aren't. And you'll also really start to notice how some passages are similar to other ones. There are actually a lot of similarities between the different passages you see on different LSATs. And rereading passages is a good way to really notice the differences and learn how to use that to your advantage. So again, whole thing is if you've already read this passage one time before in the past, you've already worked on this test, that's fine. Let's practice that. Let's practice this process of rereading, reanalyzing a passage that you've worked on before and seeing what you can get out of it. Okay, so here it is on the screen. And I'll give everybody like 4 minutes to read through the passage. And if you're done in less than 4 minutes, then look away from the screen and try to make some notes for yourself about what you think are the important main points in the passage without looking back at the passage. If anybody has any trouble reading this, let me know in the chat window. Okay, that was about 4 minutes. Let me know, for those who are here live tonight, let me know in the chat window if you're still reading, if you have not finished reading, or just give me a yes in the chat window if you have finished reading. Okay. Definitely let me know if you haven't yet. For those who are watching on YouTube, you can pause the recording if you're not done reading. Okay, so, and this little drill, this little exercise I mentioned over here on the side, this is a really great exercise to do. It's not something you would necessarily do while you're working in real time, like on the actual LSAT or on a practice test. It's not necessarily, it's definitely not something that I say people have to do. Some people do after they read the passage. You know, some people do sit there and take a few notes about what the passage was about or do some type of note taking. Some people do none of that at all. I generally don't. I'm going to read the passage. I might make some annotations while I'm reading. But generally, I'm not going to sit there after I'm done reading. This is me personally. I'm not going to sit there after I'm done reading and write out some notes about what the passage is about, or do any kind of detailed note taking. I just, you know, once I'm done reading, I pause for a second, take a breath, and then go into the questions. That's a little bit of a matter of personal preference. But when you're practicing, when you're you know, working on these passages, trying to improve your reading comprehension skills, this exercise is a really great one to do. So, you know, if you are timing yourself, it's okay to pause the timer for a second. If you're not timing yourself, then, you know, this is a great thing to do. Look away from the passage, put the passage aside, and just write out some notes to yourself about the main points that you remember. Not every detail that you remember, but what you think are the most important notes to remember, the most important things to remember about the passage. And hang on to those notes, because a really great thing to do is after you go and read the passage again, maybe, you know, when you're reviewing that same day, or maybe a couple days later, you go back and read the passage again. After you read it again, look at your notes and see if it still seems like those things that you noted are the most important things to remember, right? What this will do is help you to sharpen your ability to pay attention to the important details. And again, like we said, not every detail on the LSAT is important. Some details are not every detail in LSAT reading comprehension is important. Some details are much more important than others. All right, so now that we've had a chance to read the passage, what I'm going to do is just let's dive right into some of these questions. We're going to look at some questions from this passage. And what I'd like you to do is, let's do this. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a step-by-step process for answering questions, the process that we recommend. And this process for answering questions always begins with what we call a prephrase. So, I mean, it's pretty common, it's pretty natural to, like, when you're ready to answer questions, just read the question and then immediately start looking at the answers, right? But on the LSAT and reading comprehension, it's one of the fundamental skills that can help you increase your score is when you read the question, pause for a second and think. And basically, there are two things you want to think right now. First of all, can I answer this question from memory? Like, do I feel like I understand what this question is asking really well? And do I feel like I have a good enough, you know, sense of what a correct answer might be to go ahead and just answer from memory? Or is this a question where I should really go back and look at the passage before I answer it? And this is, even before we get into the answer choices for this is a big hesitation that people have. People are, you know, like rereading. It's really interesting when it comes down to rereading. Sometimes people are really willing to reread a lot while they're reading the passage, right? So you read the passage, and I mean, I've heard people say, you know, reread that first or that second paragraph like 3 times and didn't understand it. Well, like, it's okay to maybe reread something. Like, I might maybe reread one sentence if I really felt like that sentence is important and I didn't really quite understand it. But if you're just sitting there rereading something, you know, 3 times, a single sentence, you know, you got to move on. I definitely, while I'm reading the passage, I would not reread something like an entire paragraph 2 or 3 times. You really want to limit, or try to limit, the amount of rereading that you do while you're reading the passage for the first time. It's, you know, when you're actually working under time conditions, reading that passage for the first time, you have to be willing to say, okay, you know, I don't really get what this sentence is about, or even like, I got a little bit of an idea what this paragraph is about, but there are a lot of details that elude me. You got to be willing to say that and just move on, because it's a time test. And I think, you know, think about this. Try to notice if you find yourself rereading parts of the passage over and over and over again, trying to understand all the details or trying to get a handle on it. Sometimes you just got to move on. Where you should be willing to reread is, and where people are more reluctant to reread, is if a question is asking you something, you read the question stem, and really to answer the question, you should go back and reread part of the passage. Maybe reread a single sentence or a single line or something. And this is where people are reluctant to do it, right? So let's kind of, you know, flip-flop this. If you find yourself in either of those categories, if you find yourself rereading a lot, when you first read the passage, if you find yourself rereading a lot, let's try to minimize that. And if you find yourself, while you're working on questions, really reluctant to go back and look at the passage to help you answer a question, maybe be a little more willing to do that. Still selective about it, but a little more willing. And, you know, one of the things to realize is it's not really that terrible if you have to go back and reread part of the passage in order to answer a question, because these aren't super long passages. And even if you don't like immediately remember where to go exactly, it's probably not hard to quickly skim and find a piece of information you're looking for. Like, would somebody tell me in the chat window, what part of this passage discusses what is taught in graduate writing programs? Where would I find that in the passage? Even just approximately. In the chat window, where am I going to find information about what's taught in graduate writing programs? Okay, I love it. First paragraph. That's a fantastic answer. That's absolutely correct. First section, first paragraph. Now, maybe like it's actually starting in, starts here around line 3. Like if you said lines, you know, 3 to, you know, 3 to 5, let's say, like that would be fantastic, but you don't even need that level of specificity. If you're able to say, oh, I remember that, it was in the, I think it's in the first paragraph, that's great. And then you can quickly scan the first paragraph and find that exact information if you need it. Where would I find information about Germany? Where is Germany mentioned? See if you can remember without looking and put it in the chat window. Does anybody remember without looking, like approximately where that is? Yeah, it's in the third paragraph. Yeah, line 35 or around line 35. Yeah, it's right down here. So between lines 30 and 35. So again, this kind of general ability to remember where topics are in the passage is really important. If you're able to do that, that's a really good level of specificity, a really good level of detail. You know, remembering some of the main ideas, the big points, the main ideas that were mentioned, and where to go back approximately and find them if you need to. So for this particular question, which of the following most accurately expresses the main point of the passage? Would you go back and reread anything before answering this question, or do you think this is a question that we could answer just from our general memory, knowledge, understanding of the passage? What do you think? Go back and look before answering the question? Should we go back and look at the passage before looking at answer choices, or should we try to answer this based on our general understanding? Lisa says, let's answer. Yeah, I agree with you, Lisa. So the main point of the passage, I mean, that's one thing. If you get nothing else from the passage, even if there are a ton of details in there that you don't feel like you understand, what I hope is you always get a pretty good understanding of what the main idea is, the main point is. So yeah, let's try to answer, and maybe, you know, think about that for yourself in your own words. Just take a moment and think. And it can be really just general, just a couple of words. What's the main idea of the passage? Any thoughts about that? What's coming to mind? And even if it's just a couple words, that doesn't have to be like a fully articulated sentence. Even if it's just a couple words that come into mind, that's great. That's great. Whatever pops into your head can be really useful. Difference between writing for poetry and fiction. Yeah, that's a great thing to pop into your head, Denise. Exactly. All right. So what we've talked about here, Lisa, that's a great answer. Yeah, if that's what pops into your head, that's fantastic. Anything about difference between poetry and fiction? I mean, if that's all you got, yeah, difference between, you know, separation between fiction and poetry, or fiction and poetry being connected more. those are all great things, great ideas of a pre-phrase. So one of the, again, this is something that try to practice, even if you have to, something that people do to get better at this is exactly what I did here on the screen. People will actually cover the answers with their hand to force themselves to pause for a second and think about the question before looking at answer choices. And the whole reason we do that is because if you practice this, you'll actually find that you're better prepared to answer, to look at the answer choices. You're better prepared to think about the answer choices because you've taken a few seconds to think about the question first. All right, so the next key to success is, something at Manhattan Prep, if you look at any of our resources or go to one of our classes or look at our books or whatever, we always talk about working wrong to right. So and the reason we emphasize this so much is because it's very natural, kind of a natural test-taking habit that we pick up on, is to look at a question and then try to find the right answer. And the people who create this test are really good at doing two things. They're really good at writing answer choices that look right, but are actually completely wrong. And they're also really good at writing answer choices that look wrong, but are actually completely right. So the best defense against this is to learn to recognize what makes an answer wrong, specific words or phrases in an answer choice that actually make it wrong, and be able to use that to your advantage. So here's what I'm going to do. I want you to look at each answer. I'm going to show you the answer choices. I want you to look at each answer choice. Take a moment, look at each answer choice, and don't worry about whether it's right, but see if you notice anything wrong with it. See if you notice what's wrong with it. And just make a little list to yourself of all the answer choices that you think are wrong. And we'll talk about them. All right, how about in the chat window, for those of you who are here tonight? In the chat window, which answer choices do you think are wrong? Give me a little list of the answers that you think are wrong. Even if it's just one, that's great. Okay. Denise, would you like to, and again, if you don't want to hop on the mic, you don't have to, but would you like to hop on the mic and tell us why D is wrong? And if you want to use your microphone, hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen and there should be an unmute button in the left corner.
I think D is incorrect because it does not say that. I did not actually see that in the, it doesn't discuss how she, the way she, how she relies on traditional techniques. I did not see that in here.
Yeah, and especially it says without relying on traditional techniques. We never say, you're exactly right, Denise, we never say that Rita Dove didn't rely on traditional techniques. She did something that's a little bit unique for sure, combining like, poetry and fiction in kind of a unique way, but it never says that she totally didn't rely on traditional techniques. So, and again, notice it's just that one phrase in that answer choice, without relying on traditional techniques, that makes that answer wrong. So D is out of there. Thank you, Denise. Angela, would you like to talk about answer choice A? Let me see if I can. So if you want, you can, again, unmute your microphone. The button's in the lower left corner of the window. If you don't want to talk on, yeah, unmute your mic, great.
Yeah, so I saw that with A, Even though she has been widely acclaimed because of her elements of going back and forth, that doesn't really mean that that's the main point of the passage, since we already referred back to the main conclusion or the main point, that it has to do with fiction and poetry and how it's moving along. It doesn't really have the conclusion. It has to do with Rita Dove's work.
Okay. So that's your main argument against A is too specifically focused on Rita Dove's work.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Any of these other answer choices? Anybody want to take a shot? Let me know in the chat window if you want to take a shot at, or Denise or Angela, if you want to take a shot at one of these other answer choices, eliminating it. Shot at eliminating one of these answer choices. So notice, I want to point out answer choice B. Rita Dove's lyric narratives present clusters of narrative detail in order to create a cumulative narrative without requiring the reader to interpret it in a linear manner. I mean, isn't that really close to, where is that?
Here.
Yeah, that's kind of, it's kind of what's going on right here in this paragraph, kind of lines 40 to 50, around that area. So why is B still a wrong answer?
The clusters.
Anybody in the chat window? I'll tell you what's wrong with B. It's actually, B has a problem that's very, very common in, yeah, I love it, Lisa, too specific. It's a minor detail. So notice what the question is asking. This question is asking which of the following most accurately expresses the main point of the passage? And of the passage is what we're really interested in here. It's not like a main point. It's not the main point of the third paragraph. It's the main point of the passage. So they're very often going to give you an answer choice that sounds pretty good. It sounds just like something that was actually said in the passage. I mean, there are a lot of details in answer choice B that sound almost exactly like what they're saying here between lines 40 and 50. But this stuff is only mentioned between lines 40 and 50. So it's not going to be the main point of the passage as a whole. So that's a really tempting answer choice to look out for. Answer choices that are, sound really good. That sounds like something that they actually said in the passage, but it's not the main point of the passage as a whole. It's a minor supporting point. And actually, in order to is also questionable. If you actually read what answer choice B says, saying she presented cluster of narrative detail in order to create a cumulative narrative without requiring the reader to interpret it, that's actually not quite right either. But other than that, it sounds really good, but it's just focusing on one part of the passage. All right, so now we're down to C and E. How do we make a choice between C and E?
I think it's biased. If it's long been.
Anybody have any ideas? I'll give you a hint. If read answer choice C, because both of these answer choices sound pretty good, something's missing from answer choice C. What's missing from answer choice C? Let me ask this a different way. Oh, the word trend from the passage that includes, I don't remember the word bias, although it could be in there. Working against a bias. Okay. Working against a bias that has long been dominant in the U.S. Well, is there anything, Lisa, let me ask you this question, and you can unmute yourself if you want. Okay, sorry, Lisa, you're actually, it's saying because of the version of Zoom you're using, I can't let you talk, but maybe in the chat window. Is there anything in here that's even kind of like a bias, some kind of bias that's being described in the passage? and I'll give you an idea. We're kind of talking about this idea of, yeah, a bias against, Lisa, you're absolutely right, a bias against the connection between fiction and poetry. So there's kind of a bias here. We're talking about existing views and kind of these rigid views that poetry, and in the US at least, where poetry and fiction are viewed as separate, and where, you know, graduate writing programs and universities train students as poets or writers of fiction, but almost never as both. So there certainly seems to be, or where it says, US culture is often suspicious, casts a suspicious eye on the generalist, as if ability in one field diluted or compromised is diluted or compromised by accomplishment in another. So you're absolutely right, Lisa, that the passage does, you know, and it might be in here. Oh, actually, the word bias is in here. I just found it. I just noticed at line 21. There are signs that the bias against writers who cross generic boundaries is diminishing. So the word bias is in there. But here's something for everybody to remember, Lisa, for you to remember, and everybody. It's okay if an answer choice mentions something that was described in the passage, even if they don't use that exact word. So what I was about to say is, even if we hadn't spotted that word bias in line 21, even if that exact word bias wasn't there, if there's enough description in the passage that is describing a bias, even if they don't use that exact word, that would still be okay for answer choice C. Answer choice C isn't, even if they didn't use the exact word bias in the passage, answer choice C would still be okay. And this is a really important point, because a lot of people will get rid of answer choices for that reason, because it's using a word that wasn't actually used in the passage. And one of the most important things to remember about reading comprehension is a lot of the answer choices that you're going to see, correct answers, are not really direct quotes from the passage. You know, some answers are asking you for something taken directly from the passage, but we actually call these main point questions synthesis questions. It's the term we use for them, because the correct answer will synthesize or connect or combine information from several points in the passage. It's not just going to be narrowly focused on one part of the passage. So this is one of the most important things to remember about LSAT reading comprehension questions, is they don't always pull language directly from the passage. In fact, one of the ways that the test writers hide correct answers is by not really using language taken directly from the passage, but the description is accurate in that it has the same meaning. So in terms of answer choice C, if you haven't seen it yet, notice that answer choice C, so working against the bias that has long been dominant in the US, yeah, we actually are talking about that. Even if they didn't use the word bias, it kind of sounds like what we're talking about. Recent writers like Rita Dove, which, yeah, we're talking about, one important example of this trend is Rita Dove, so that's supported in here in line 25, have shown that the lyrical use of language can effectively enhance narrative fiction. So certainly the lyrical use of language, yeah, we're talking about that. We're talking about, you know, using poetic language in fiction, you know, can effectively enhance narrative fiction. The reason why C is wrong, and this is a really small detail, minor detail between C and E. And I'm gonna ask you, I've kind of given you a hint about it, but does anybody see a significant difference between C and E? How is E different from C in a way that actually makes E correct and C incorrect? What's the difference between the two? Notice how E talks about Rita Dove. So it talks about Rita Dove, successful blending of poetry and fiction. So it's talking about her blending of both poetry and fiction, exemplifies the trend away from the separation of the two genres, which is really what the passage is about. Yeah, and exactly, Lisa. C emphasizes that she's showing that the lyrical use of language can enhance narrative fiction, but we're not just talking about enhancing fiction. We're also talking about using fictional structures to enhance poetic writing, right? So it's both. E really focuses on the both poetry and fiction, how we're blending both to enhance both or to eliminate this rigid separation between the two. Whereas E is just talking about effectively enhancing fiction, narrative fiction, which is only one side of the coin. Small difference, right? Small difference between E and C. What are some of the things that you're seeing here in just this one question that we talked about? So we just spent a lot of time picking this question apart. What are some of the things that you've noticed? And I'm going to give everybody, you know, a little bit of time to write this in the chat window. What are some of your takeaways? What are some of the things you've seen in the way we just discussed this question that you think can help you in LSAT reading comprehension? Okay, excellent. Lisa said the pre-phrasing, right? The strategy of thinking of the answer first before reviewing the answers. Yeah, interrogate each answer to see if it really it refers back to the question at hand. Yeah, see, like be aware of that. Sometimes they'll give you an answer that it's actually not terrible. And in fact, one of the things that makes answer choice B tough to spot as a wrong answer is because it does include so many things that were explicitly discussed, so many terms that were explicitly mentioned in the passage. And a lot of people gravitate towards that. They gravitate towards the answer that seems to contain the most words from the passage. But that's not what we're looking for, right? We're not looking really for a direct quote from the passage. We're looking for something that describes the main point of the passage as a whole. And yeah, eliminating incorrect answers. So think about some of these things that you wrote, you know, thinking about the answer first before reviewing the answers, question each answer to see if it accurately refers back to the question at hand, and then eliminating incorrect answers. So think about how you can use those takeaways the next time you're looking at a question. So you work on a question, and then you're going to try to like answer that question yourself or analyze that question yourself. Think about how you can focus on those takeaways and use those when you're analyzing, when you're reviewing a question. Think about those specific details, because that'll do two things. It'll help you understand the question better, right? Help you understand why the correct answer is correct and why the wrong answers are wrong. But you're also reinforcing the idea of thinking about those things while you're working in real time. You know, there are a lot of things that we want to do on the LSAT that are really great and really important, but they're hard to do in the limited amount of time that you have to work on questions. That's why you have to practice them kind of in slow motion. You know, it's like Tai Chi. If you know anything about Tai Chi, it's a martial art and they do everything really, really slowly. But then if somebody tries to like grab you, you move really fast, you're like adrenaline kicks in and you do what you've practiced. So you've practiced this so slowly and precisely that you just like grab the person and throw them on the ground and tie them up in a knot. That's kind of the idea. And that works well in the LSAT too. Taking the time to review questions thoroughly and really thinking through things carefully. If you do that multiple times with multiple questions, you're actually reinforcing these pathways in your mind and these ways of actually thinking about the questions to the point where you can do them. You start doing this really quickly. All right. So, excellent, excellent. So here's something that you can do too, an exercise that's really useful, in addition to everything that we just said. If you had problems with this, like maybe this is a question that you found difficult, or maybe you, I'll start with two things. One is if you just generally find a question difficult. One of the most useful things to do is go back and look at the correct answer and see if you can find support for the correct answer in the passage. Why does answer choice E describe the main idea of the passage? So Rita Dove's successful blending of poetry and fiction. So, that's all what's talked about here. That's why, Rita Dove is given as an example of this, her work in both genres, right? And the rest of this kind of talks about her successful blending of both. Recent trend away from the rigid separation of the two genres. So this is all about the rigid separation of the two genres. And we're saying, Rita Dove is given as an example of us moving away from that. So if you can look at this answer choice E and relate it to the specific topics that are mentioned in the passage and understand how that actually does describe the main point of the passage as a whole, then that's going to go a long way towards helping you understand how the correct answers to main point questions are written. If another answer seemed appealing, right, do what we just did. Try to really like look at each piece of this answer and compare it to, so try to find the relevant part of the passage. You know, her work has been widely acclaimed primarily because, okay, why do we talk about, you know, why Rita Dove's work has been widely acclaimed? Because of the lyrical elements she introduced into her fiction. Is that the only reason why she's widely acclaimed? No, that's not the only reason why she's widely acclaimed. And the passage isn't really, it's not that the passage isn't about Rita Dove. It's not about why she's been widely acclaimed. That's not really what the passage is about. It's about her as an example. It's about how she's an example of something. That's a big difference between answer choice E and answer choice A. The passage is about how she exemplifies this thing, not the reason why she's widely acclaimed. So this is a really important thing to do too, a really useful thing. If you picked answer choice A as a correct answer, go back and look at the differences between those two answers. How is answer choice, you know, if you picked answer choice A and you know that answer choice E is correct, how are those two answers different? What's the big differences between those two answers? Just like we looked at here. What's the biggest difference? And how does that difference inform you about why one answer is correct and one isn't for this question, right? Why is this the correct answer for this question and this one not? If you're down to two answers, another common thing is like if you're having a hard time choosing between C and E, then why, you know, what is the big difference between answer choice C and answer choice E? Again, answer choice C is focusing on the lyrical use of language, enhancing narrative fiction, whereas answer choice E is talking about the trend away from the rigid separation. Why does that make answer choice C correct and why does that make answer choice E correct and answer choice C incorrect? So this is a great exercise to do when you're reviewing. You know, if two answer choices seem appealing, or if the correct answer didn't seem appealing and a wrong answer did, what's the difference? What is the big difference between those? So again, what this will do is it'll help you learn to read more specifically, learn to pay attention to the details in the answer choices that are going to help you decide between right and wrong answers, and especially the details that make the wrong answers wrong. And how do you relate those details to both the question that you're being asked and the information that you're given in the passage? Okay, let's look at another question. And here's what we're going to do. I'd like you to practice this process that we just did. We're going to practice all of this. We're going to practice, kind of put together everything that we just talked about. So let me find another question, which would be a good one to look at. Okay, here's a good one. What I'd like you to do is, I'm going to have you do these steps by yourself. All right, I'm not going to walk you through it. So let's just, and I'm going to give you 45 seconds to answer this question. So here's what I want to do. When the question comes up on the screen, the first thing I want you to do is take a breath. Then I want you to read the question stem. It's going to be a little hard to do because you're going to be forcing yourself to slow down a little bit. Take a breath, read the question stem, pause for a second before you look at the answer choices, and just think, you know, what do I think a correct answer might look like? What is this question asking me about? What is the main thing that this question is asking me about? And what does that do? Does it help me predict at all anything about the answers? Right? So take a breath, read the question stem, pause for a second and think about it. And then when you look at the answer choices, the first thing you should be doing is looking for answers that you can eliminate. Which answers, even if it's just one that immediately stands out at you as wrong, then which answer choice is it that immediately stands out as wrong? If you can eliminate and just write down any answers that stand out to you as wrong. And if you can eliminate 4 answers, that's great. Put the remaining one in the chat window. We'll see if that's the correct answer. If you get down to 2, then again, slow down even more and read each answer choice carefully and see if you notice something that helps you choose between them. All right, so take a breath, read the question, pause for a second to think about the question, look at the answer choices and try to notice which answer choices seem wrong to you, seem the most wrong. Write those down. If you're looking at 2 or 3 that all seem appealing, take another breath, read each one a little more slowly and see if you notice details that help you choose between them. All right, let's do that. Here it is. Okay, that was a little bit over 45 seconds, but let's see how we did on this. Did everybody remember to take a breath before you looked at the question, before you read the question? Did you remember to read the question and pause for a second before you looked at the answer choices? Awesome, I'm seeing some yeses in the chat window. Which answer choices were you able to eliminate? Are there any of these answer choices that seemed definitely wrong? Put those in the chat window. Okay. A and B, D and E. Okay. So we're eliminating A and B, D and E. Okay. How about let's go with Angela again. Angela, would you like to unmute your mic and tell me about those answers that you eliminated and why? And first of all, before you do that, I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Tell me what would you think, like after you read this question, what are you thinking just after you read the question, before you even look at the answer choices? What thoughts popped into your head?
Well, the first thing that I saw was the most likely to believe. So after the previous question, we were able to get the main conclusion from it. So we can kind of infer based on that what was she trying to figure out, or what was the main passage that she would believe. So it would definitely have to be something that would have at least Rita Dove or some sort of writer, or it would have to be with poetry and fiction coming together in recent times rather than later. So that was my first intuition of what would be of what I would expect one of the answers would be.
Mm-hmm. And who is this question asking us about? Whose opinion are we being asked about?
The authors.
The author. So that's one important thing to notice. We're being asked about what the author thinks, the author of the passage, right? Not Rita Dove, but the author of this particular LSAT reading comprehension, whatever essay in whatever academic journal they are using for this passage. So whoever wrote this thing, what this person is likely to believe. So we're being asked for something that they would agree with, right? Not disagree, but what would they be likely to believe? Now, one thing I like a lot of the answers you gave, but where it says would be most likely to believe which of the following, what most likely to believe means is it doesn't actually refer to the main point, but out of these 4 answer choices, which one would the author be most likely to believe out of those answer choices? Not the main thing. What's the main thing that the author would be likely to believe? So we're not really looking, it doesn't have to relate to the main point. But what that's saying is there might be maybe more than one answer choice that looks okay, but it's the one that actually is the author's most likely to believe in. And Angela, one more question. Are we being asked for a direct quote from the passage, or are we being asked for, is it kind of like the last question where the correct answer doesn't even have to include something directly stated in the passage?
I think that since it's like again, it's most likely to believe, depending on the answer and how confident you are, or depending on the answer choice, you may have to go back just to reread a certain section. So maybe me personally, I may not be confident enough to based upon my memory, I could answer it. I feel like I would have to maybe go back into the passage.
Okay, good. Yeah, like that's okay to say, hey, I might need to go back into the passage to answer this question. But what is this word where it says it can be inferred from the passage? What is that telling us?
It's kind of like it can be inferred, meaning that it can be like you can assume.
Yeah, it's kind of like assume. It's inferred. It's something you could conclude. You could conclude that the author would be likely to believe one of these, but it's not necessarily something that's directly stated in the passage. So that's one of the things that you know, when you're reviewing this question, like look, Angela and I just spent like a minute or two talking just about the question stem and what is the question stem actually saying and what is it actually asking us? This is something you can and should do on your own, especially with questions that you find difficult. Make sure you understand, like, what is the question actually asking? Is this asking me for something explicitly stated in the passage or not? And again, this question isn't. It's asking us for something that we can like conclude, infer based on what's said in the passage. All right. So Angela, what's wrong with answer choice A? Why would we get rid of that?
So for answer choice A, once I saw each of Dove's works, it kind of threw me off because I know that she never inferred or like the author never talked about each of Dove's works. So we can't really deny or confirm that statement. So it'd be hard for us to believe that, let alone the author. So that's how I saw it. So that's how I just marked A as wrong.
Okay. Now, based on what I just said a moment ago, though, that the correct answer, you know, inferred from the passage means it doesn't have to be something explicitly stated in the passage. Does that change your answer at all about that each of Dove's works?
Not necessarily, because as I continue working through it, I mean, it can be classified either through like primarily poetry or primarily fiction. I mean, both of these, I mean, from the author, I don't believe that the author would believe this most likely element.
Okay.
Because I guess it can contain both, but I don't know. I guess maybe each of the Doves might have thrown me off in the sense like, no, she wouldn't, like the author wouldn't necessarily agree with this because we can't infer it.
Yeah,
So,
it seems like a lot to infer about
yeah.
each of Dove's works. Yeah. So just based on this, like, hey, it's what was it, 4 paragraphs? Can we really infer something about each of Dove's works?
Exactly.
Okay. What about answer choice B, Bravo?
So with this one, when I was thinking like it's representation of a sequence of events rather than its ability to evoke inner states, I was a little confused in the sense of what does that mean, referring back to the question. It's like, can the author, like, would the author believe that? And based upon like inferring from the passage, I don't believe that the author would be most likely to believe that one. Maybe it's possible, but I don't think that would be the most likely to believe it.
Okay. Is there anything wrong with it? Is there anything like something that would make us like, and this is, you know, do you see something that really makes you say, no, there's no way this is the right answer?
I mean, the first thing that threw me up was the aesthetic value of lyric narrative. And my first question was in that passage, I never saw that. And so I just referred to like referring from the passage and then looking back is like, are they most likely to believe that? I can't deny or confirm that again. It's like, I don't know because I didn't get that intuition based upon the author's passage.
And where do we talk about lyric narratives, this whole lyric narrative thing? Where's that coming from anyway? What part of the passage is that coming from?
That comes from lines between 40 and 45, and that's when they kind of integrate together. But I don't see, I guess that's like a representation. But the aesthetic value of it, I don't know. I guess maybe that word usage might have just thrown me off in the sense that I didn't infer that from the passage. Therefore, I don't believe the author would be most likely to believe it.
Yeah, and you just said something a moment ago that's actually really good, a really good thing to keep in mind when we talk about lyric narrative. It's Rita Dove's combining the poetry and fiction together, right? That's what the author is describing. You know, indeed, her poetry offers example after example of what can only be properly regarded as lyric narrative. So even if you don't exactly know what lyric narrative is, you get this idea that this is the way the author described Rita Dove's poetry, right? Rita Dove's writing. And so would the author believe that the value of it is in how it represents events and not in its ability to evoke inner states? Like that seems like the whole dividing of fiction and it's the whole dividing of fiction and poetry that the author is saying, hey, this is a bias, right? This isn't really a good thing. What's really more like interesting is how authors are able to combine these two. So this is kind of going against the author of the passage, is the whole like idea and main idea of the passage, right? Is that, hey, we're going to separate these things.
Mhm.
Okay, awesome. How about Denise? And we'll wrap this up a little bit. We'll talk about a couple more of these answer choices, and then we'll wrap this up and talk about some takeaways. But Denise, do you want to unmute your mic and tell me about some of these answer choices that you eliminated and why you eliminated them? And Denise, if you're thinking, that's fine. If you want to talk, if you click on the unmute button in the lower left corner of your screen.
Sorry, I didn't see the unmute button.
Yeah, no problem. It disappears sometimes. All right, so tell me about answer choice D and E. You wanted to eliminate those.
D, in the passage, the author doesn't imply that he doesn't imply that either poetry or lyrical language is superior, that one is superior to the other.
Mm-hmm.
Don't implied in the passage.
Yeah, aesthetically superior. Like, yeah, the author seems to be thinking it's really wonderful that, you know, Rita Dove and other authors can combine these two. It goes against this rigid separation, but really doesn't get into whether one's actually better than the other. The author's just kind of saying, hey, it's possible to connect them. They don't have to remain separated. So that's exactly it. What about E echo?
Only Dove is discussed in the passage. It doesn't talk about other writers or the writers who successfully cross generic boundary. It doesn't even go into that in the passage.
Yeah, did anybody see any lines, and you could put this in the chat window, or Denise, you can answer this. Does anybody see any lines where we talk about writers who successfully combine poetry and fiction, try other genres? Do we?
Dove is the only one the author discussed.
Mm-hmm. Notice down here in lines, was it 33? When Dove was in Germany, she observed poets write plays, novelists compose libretti, playwrights write novels. So we are talking about other writers and where they're crossing the boundary between poetry and fiction. So, you know, poets write plays. I guess that's kind of like what's being said here, but do they try their hand at other genres such as drama? So it's kind of, E is kind of talking about, hey, if you cross over from one type to another, then you're likely to cross over to a third type. And the closest we get, so the only time we really talk about other writers specifically other than Dove is down here. And we're not really saying that, hey, if poets write plays, they're also going to try this other thing too. It's not what it says. So E is, you know, if you thought it kind of sounded like, you know, 33 to 36 there, maybe, but again, it's going beyond what's even said in the passage. Not just going beyond what's said, but going beyond what we would infer or what we would conclude from what was said. So answer choice C. Is answer choice C the correct answer? The way in which Dove blends genres in her writing is without precedent in U.S. writing. What do you all think about that? Without precedent. Is that something the author would believe? Do we have support for that in the passage? So that's always going to be the question, is if, even if it doesn't explicitly say that in the passage, there needs to be some support for it. Without precedent like that's kind of the what this answer choice hinges on. This answer choice is hinging on the idea that Dove, in blending these two things together, is without precedent in US writing. Nobody did it before her. So where do we have support for that? So notice, Lisa, you're saying the author is commending Rita Dove for her work, but does that mean that Rita Dove is the first one to do it? First paragraph. Denise, where in the first paragraph? Tell me what lines. It does say for decades there was a deep rift. Okay. Line 5 said, so this is talking about graduate writing programs, train students as one or the other, but almost never as both. So this is certainly setting the idea that there's been a trend, there's been a tendency. But here's the thing. It says when we where do we talk about specifically? Yeah, one important example. So Lisa, I notice what you wrote. You're keying in on actually the important line. Rita Dove is described as one important example of this trend. So we know it's not just Rita Dove. You know, there are signs that this bias against writers who cross generic boundaries is diminishing. So we're talking about the bias against writers who cross generic boundaries. So that almost implies that, you know, writers have been doing this, there's just a bias against it. And it says one important example of this trend. So the thing that you wrote, Lisa, that's really that's really important is you said the third paragraph says one important example. Maybe it's important because it's a precedent, but do we know that? Can we really infer that? There's a little bit of information that makes us think maybe Rita Dove is not the first, because the author doesn't say the first author to buck the trend. I mean, the author seems to really think favorably of Rita Dove. Maybe I would think maybe the author would tell us if she really was the first, but the author never describes her as the first. And the author does describe, you know, writers against, you know, bias against writers who cross generic boundaries is diminishing. Not that it's never happened, but just that the bias against it is diminishing. The bias against it is diminishing. So C is actually wrong. C is actually not the right answer, and A is the right answer. So why is A the right answer? Each of Dove's works. So, you know, what we said earlier, Angela pointed out is, you know, do we really talk about each of Dove's works? Do we really know anything about each of Dove's works? So I'm curious if anybody can find any support for A, any support for the idea that the author would believe that each of Dove's works can be classified either primarily as poetry or primarily as fiction. Notice it doesn't say exclusively, it just says primarily. Where do we find support for that? '26. What is 26? So she's highly acclaimed for both her poetry and her fiction. So yeah, we're talking about them as if they're two separate things. So notice, so here's another question, similar to one I asked you earlier. Remember I was asking you questions like, where do we find, you know, graduate writing programs? Where do we find information about Germany? Where do we find a description of Rita Dove's writing? Where would we look for if we were saying, like, where does the author actually talk about Rita Dove's writing and what it's like? 36. So 36 is talking about not understanding our restrictiveness. But notice in the, yeah, we start to see more like lines 37 here, we start to see a description of what Rita Dove's writing is like. And notice how the author talks about Rita Dove's writing. The author talks about her use of language in these poems is lyrical. And then we talk about down here, many passages in her fiction. So the author is specifically talking about her works as works of either poetry or fiction. Because the author specifically talks about them as works of poetry or works of fiction, then there's support for A. Even though I would agree with you, the passage never explicitly says that, the author, the passage never specifically mentions in those words each of Dove's works. The passage never explicitly says that the author thinks they can be classified either primarily as poetry or primarily as fiction, but the author refers to them as works of poetry or as works of fiction. And again, this is something that you might get from reading, other LSAT passages and seeing how things are worded. But there are passages that describe things as like being blended into some new form, right? Does the author never says that they can't be distinguished as, Rita Dove's works are so blended that they cannot be distinguished as either poetry or fiction. There's something new or there's something different or they're a blend. Poiction or something, right? So the author does explicitly describe them as poems and as fiction, which is our support for answer choice A. It's tough, right? Answer choice A is a really tough answer to spot. It's tough to spot as correct. But what I would argue is there's more support for A because the author specifically describes them as poems and as fiction. And notice how, like, let me ask that question in the chat. Does everybody see that? Does everybody see how the author is explicitly describing in lines, where is it, 42 and lines 51 to 52, describing her works as poetry and fiction, explicitly describes them as two different things. And do you see where we have to make more assumptions? Well, maybe like when she says that she's an important example, when the author says that Rita Dove is an important example, maybe that means like, that she was the first. So this, again, the whole idea here, I think this question is a really great example of, and here's what might happen, right? Here's what often is going to happen, is you get a question wrong. Yeah, absolutely, Angela. More assumptions can be dangerous. And I believe we're making far more assumptions to if we infer or conclude that the author thinks that Dove's writing is without precedent. We're making far more we're making far more assumptions to go from an important example to saying without precedent. And that's what's dangerous about picking C. We're making far fewer assumptions and really not many assumptions at all when the author explicitly describes her works as either poetry or fiction. Cool. So this is what happens very often on the LSAT, right? You get a question wrong and you're really perturbed because you picked answer choice C and you thought answer choice C was actually a good answer, or you eliminated A and B and D and E and you were really confident that they were all wrong, so you picked C because it was the only one left. And then you find out it's the wrong answer. C is the wrong answer. And so that process that we just went through of saying, okay, where do I find in the passage, not that exact quote, but where do I find the support for that in the passage? What language is talking about the way in which Rita Dove blends genres in her writing? And where do we talk about, okay, then maybe A is the right answer. Maybe you look in the answer key and say, A is the right answer? Really? A? Why is A the right answer? So then you go back and you look for the language that supports that. Not that explicitly says it, but that supports that as an answer. And so, like I said, there are times when you want to reread things and there are times that you don't. A time when you don't want to reread things is while you're actually reading the passage for the first time. Again, rereading one sentence, especially if it's something that you think is pretty important to know. yeah, that's fine. If you have to read something twice, that's fine. Rereading an entire paragraph twice or 3 times, rereading a sentence 3 or 4 times, not what you want to do. You got to be willing to move on. Remember, a lot of these details that are in this passage, we never even talked about, right? There are a lot of details in here that don't come up in any of the questions. So be a little bit stingy about how often you reread something while you're reading the passage initially. Where you should be willing to reread is if you need to make a choice between 2 answer choices. If you're looking at 2 answer choices and you notice a difference between them and you feel like going back to the passage will help you see which one is more correct or which one is incorrect, do that. Another time to reread and do a lot of rereading is when you review. When you're going back and looking at answer choices, you're looking at questions that you answered, either questions you answered incorrectly or questions that you struggled with. Being able to really read the answers carefully and go back and find the support for that answer in the passage is what will help you sharpen your ability to spot wrong answers and to correctly eliminate the wrong answers, and sharpen your ability to know, like, how does the LSAT actually write answer choices? How does the LSAT actually word correct answer choices in a way that makes them not really seem that great? And what kind of details do they include in incorrect answer choices that really make those answer choices wrong? So Lisa, you had a good question in the chat window. Will every question be like that? Asking about what can be inferred, about what someone may believe, have an answer that the passage could substantially support? Yeah, every question like this, when a question asks about something that can be inferred. So this is answering your question, Lisa. When a question asks about something that can be inferred from the passage, there will be support. The 2 things to remember about the correct answer: it's not going to be a direct quote from the passage. When it says inferred, it's not going to be something that was directly stated, but there will be support for it. There will be one of these answers where you can point to the lines or the words in the passage that actually help us make that inference, that help us conclude that that is the correct answer, that provides support for that answer. And just as importantly, the other answer choices will have language in them that is sometimes contradicted, or at the very least does not have clear support. There's going to be language, there's going to be something wrong with the other answer choices that makes them not supportable, or they would require more assumptions. They would require a bunch of assumptions in order to go from what's in the passage to what's in the answer choice. All right, so hopefully what you're taking away from this, I know we went over time a little bit, thanks for sticking around. What we are taking away from this, hopefully, is some ideas about how the LSAT writes questions, how they write answer choices, and some techniques that you can use to successfully analyze, and it's not always whether you get a question right the first time. That's actually, when you're preparing for the LSAT, I know it's frustrating when you don't get questions correct, but that's not really what's important. What's important is what you do with them after, and your ability to go and really pick the answer choices apart and relate, understand the question, relate what's in each answer choice to what's being asked in the question. What is this answer choice? How does this answer choice connect to what I'm actually being asked for in this question? And then being able to connect correct answers to what's said in the passage, being able to connect incorrect answers and specific language and incorrect answers to things that are, the opposite of what's said in the passage, or at the least unsupported. All right. That's all we got. So for those of you watching tonight on YouTube, thanks for being here. I promised I would share some links to some free resources and other information. So if you are here with us tonight, I'll put that in the chat window. If you're watching on YouTube, then you can find those links in the, scroll down and find those links in the information for the video. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks for being here. I hope this is useful. I hope this is interesting. And good luck in your LSAT prep.